Welcome everyone, my name is Anne Lord, librarian at the Australian Wine Research Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, Whole Bunch Fermentation. It is also my pleasure to welcome today's presenter, Cathy Howard, winemaker at Witcher Ridge in the southwest of Western Australia. Cathy studied oenology at Roseworthy Agricultural College in the late 1980s, graduating in 1991. Over the past 25 years, Cathy has worked as cider maker, lab manager and brewer at Cascade Brewery, as well as a winemaker for wineries in South Australia and Western Australia. For the past 7 years, she has run her own winemaking consultancy business and writes technical articles for the Wine and Viticulture Journal on topics covering all aspects of viticulture and winemaking through to wine marketing. Cathy and her husband Neil launched their own wine brand Witcher Ridge in 2008. Before I hand over to Cathy, I have a couple of quick points as to what to expect for those who are new to AWRI webinars. The format for today is a short presentation followed by a Q&A. The webinar is being recorded and will be available to view via the AWRI website. It is important to remember that webinars are interactive and there are a number of ways to get involved. To ask a question, please type into the question section of your control panel in the bottom right corner of your screen. For those with access to a microphone, there is also the option of speaking directly with our presenter by clicking the Raise Hand button. This is located in the top left section of your control panel. Please feel free to send through questions at any time, as well as during the Q&A session. I will get through as many questions through to Cathy as possible. Finally, if you would like to get involved through Twitter, please use the Twitter handle @the_AWRI. Okay, that's enough from me now. I'm going to hand over to Cathy to tell us more about today's topic. Thank you, Cathy.
Thank you, Anne. Good morning, everyone. What I'm presenting today is from an article that I wrote for the Wine and Viticulture Journal back in April 2015. And the article was entitled Whole Bunch Fermentation, a Wildcard Inclusion in Red Winemaking. Like many of the articles that I write, this one certainly seems that the circle is turning yet again with another winemaking practice, as winemakers across the globe are seeking out new techniques to improve the quality and complexity of their wines, to enhance the varietal and site-specific characteristics, and ultimately to create an edge, a point of difference for their wine over others in the marketplace. Or quite simply, like many of us, we're passionate about making the best wine that we possibly can each year. There are many winemaking techniques being practiced now which were once regarded as outmoded practices, and this certainly includes stems in red wine ferments. And it's been much talked about over the last 10 or so, even 5 years. A whole bunch or whole cluster inclusion into red wine ferments is now becoming a fashionable winemaking tool for those seeking elegance over power. So whole bunch, what indeed is whole bunch inclusion for fermentation? So it's when the entire grape cluster goes into the fermentation vessel, completely bypassing the destemmer or crusher. So since mechanical harvesters and destemmer crushers have only existed for about 50 years, historically speaking, all red wines prior to the introduction of these pieces of vineyard and winery equipment would have been fermented as whole bunches. So in my next slide, I've actually, I found a quote, it was yesterday actually, from a Wine Business Monthly blog, how an incredible tour flipped perceptions of Aussie wine. And I thought it was very poignant with its timing. And the quote's from Tim Wildman, Master of Wine, who wrote the article. So winemakers using whole bunch have come out of the closet and are now proud to be bunchy. This is a technique and a conversation that's been building from the edges for the past few years. But I was struck on this trip not only by how many producers are now using this technique, but also how many are mastering the skills. So on the next slide, I'll just do a little bit of a history of where whole bunch ferments have come from and the French connection. So they have their origins in Burgundy in the Rhone Valley. Excuse me. Its use in these two French regions has influenced winemakers around the world to use the practice in their winemaking. And in recent years, there has been an increase in its adoption around the globe, as we'll find out. So in the next slide, it's traditionally been used in the northern Rhone Valley. So in Côte Rôtie, Shiraz is made using whole bunch fermentations of varying percentages, and also sometimes co-fermented with Viognier. The Côte Rôtie wines have around 30% whole bunch, although some wines reach as much as 100%. And there is a quote that I found, which I talk about a little bit later, from Jeremy Pringle, where he actually came across a wine that had 110% whole bunch in it. So moving on to the southern Rhone on the next slide. Further south are the AOCs of Hermitage, Cornas and St. Joseph, all producing Shiraz. So stem inclusion depends more on the producer's style rather than tradition, the further south you move in Rhone. On average, the Côte Rôtie wines have around 30% whole cluster, although as I said before, some reach as high as 100%. In these regions, stem inclusion is not as commonplace as it is in the north. In the southern Rhone, however, there are more producers using whole cluster fermentation, and it seems that there are those that are converting to it after years of destemming and crushing their grapes. So looking at Burgundy on the next slide, Burgundy has an interesting history with using whole bunch fermentation, and it is centred around the influence of one person, Henri Jailleux, of Premier Cru Cros Parentu, hope I said that correctly, who said, stems, stems, why would you ever use stems? We never have ripe stems in Burgundy. Pinot Noir is a relatively low tannin grape variety, as many of you know, and therefore can lack the broader, silky mouthfeel and additional length that tannins provide in other red varieties. Stem inclusion will bring additional tannin to the ferment, but they can also introduce herbaceous green vegetative characteristics and creative stringency on the palate. Jailleux influenced many to move away from using whole bunch inclusion, and the popularity of destemming across the region was linked with the corresponding reduction in sappy green characters in many red Burgundies. So there was a good reason for doing it. In Burgundy now, again, similar to southern Rhone, there is a tendency to move back towards including stems. This is partly attributed to the passing of Henri Jailleux, also partly attributed to a changing climate, and the stems are certainly now more often riper than they used to be. So moving to the next slide, where we just have a little quick overview of the positives of using whole bunch inclusion. These 2 points that I have on this slide I found from Jamie Good in his Wine Anorak blog, Whole Bunches and Stems in Red Winemaking. And his first one is the enhanced aromatic expression of the wine, and it's common to find an elevated sappy green floral edged pronounced fruity aromas, which is really attractive. The second positive he finds is freshness associated with the whole bunch. If it's done well, whole cluster can help make wines that are more elegant than their totally destemmed counterparts. Good also adds that whole bunch wines sometimes start out with distinctive flavours and aromas that can be a little surprising, but these often resolve nicely with time in the bottle. So moving on to the next slide and the negatives. So whole bunch inclusion in ferments is quite controversial, and it can divide winemakers and wine writers. I found an article by Hugh and Hook in the Sydney Morning Herald from 2011 which was titled "The Stalk Delivers." Here Hook talks about an argument between a Stalk hater, Richard Jennings, who said, "What possesses winemakers to take a beautiful ingredient and obscure its deliciousness with extraneous flavours taken from much lesser material?" Hook then replies, in the winemaker's defence, that many of the most complex, fascinating and charming Australian Pinots include a well-judged, in brackets read subtle, quantity of stalks in the ferment. Hook then continued when he talked about specialist Burgundy scribe Alan Meadows, who asked the winemaker we just talked about, Henri Jaillert, who was the stalk hater, if he'd ever enjoyed chewing on a grape stalk. Jaillert replied, no. Hook then says, but had Meadows ever enjoyed chewing on a piece of oak barrel? He continues, it doesn't mean it can't add something interesting to the wine, and anyway, neither stalks nor oak become a part of the wine. They simply have contact with it for a time. In a sense, stalks are like oak. Too much is bad and neither should dominate, but if sensitively used, both can add something. So this brings us to the next slide and the uncertainties of what whole bunch fermentation can bring. There are many different practices being used for whole bunch fermentations, and I did contact 3 winemakers that, from Canberra, Yarra Valley, and also one who's now working in Burgundy and Hermitage, and we'll talk about them a little bit later and their views on it. But it seems that the use of whole bunches in fermentation can be a bit of a wild card, depending on the site and on the vintage. When it works well, it delivers incredibly complex aromatics and flavours. Aromas and flavours have been described as clean earth, green tobacco, unlit cigar tobacco, spicy heady florals like lilac and rose petal, black or white pepper and snap peas, sometimes even cologne and agave. I'm not quite sure if those 2 would be considered a positive, but they were noted down as such. And as I mentioned, the whole cluster fermentation can also yield a negative result, with the wine being herbaceous, vegetative and also green. Right, so on to the next slide. Our variables include variety, vintage and site variations. There is also the effect of having whole berries in the ferment, as in what you see in carbonic maceration. There's the effect of having the stalks in the ferment. There is also the variable of what percentage of whole bunch to use. And then finally, the other variable that is in play is when you add the whole bunches to the ferment. So starting with variety and site specific on the next slide, whole bunch fermentation is most commonly associated with Pinot Noir and Shiraz. Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc and Merlot all do have a degree of greenness in their varietal flavour signature. That's certainly something that most winemakers seek to minimise and don't want to risk exaggerating by including stems. So for each variety too, there is variation, like we deal with every day with other factors when we're looking at when to harvest grapes, from vintage to vintage, the variation within blocks and the variation between sites. So starting with the whole berry effect, the next slide. So the inclusion of whole bunches, obviously in a ferment, also means the inclusion of whole uncrushed berries. Now this slide and the next few slides are attributed to comments made by Professor Roger Bolton, who is the Professor of Enology and Chemical Engineering at the University of California at Davis. So he also says the fermentation of whole berries in the clusters could make small contributions to flavour with a carbonic maceration character. This character is released and is obviously most, this character is released and is most obvious at pressing. So on the next slide I talk about stalk effect. Just in the background, there's a little bit of a giggle for you. That's our pet sheep, who actually does enjoy eating stalks. It was the only stalk photo that I could find to include with the slides. So it's a bit of fun for Thursday. So starting with the stalks, the stems have higher tannin levels than berries, but there is little evidence, according to Bolton, that it is extracted during fermentation. He goes on to say that in fermentations with dry woody stems that are lignified, there can be a herbaceous aroma contributed, which he describes as a black tea or a cedary character. He goes on to clarify that this character, however, is when the berries have been removed from the stems or the stalks, and the stalks have been added back into the must. So therefore, this character he doesn't consider to be the result of a true whole bunch fermentation. So moving on to what percentage of whole bunch, and it varies widely from anywhere from about 0.5% up to 100% or more. So I did mention Jeremy Pringle a little while ago. He wrote a blog, A Whole Bunch of Action at the Yarra Valley Wine Program in September 2011. And he was just talking about what winemakers were doing with whole bunch fermentation in the Yarra and in Hillsville actually. And he says, for the record, Gary Mills spoke about adapting the percentage of whole bunches depending on the vineyard in question. Thus, you've got 60% in the 2010 Hillsville Syrah, 100% in the 2010 Sylvan, and 50% in the 2010 Garden Gully. Timo Meyer from Meyer Wines talked about stem inclusion in reference to Pinot. He uses it to add savouriness if the fruit from a vineyard is a little too rich or sweet. And this is where Jeremy says that in one instance he did come across even a ferment that it had 110% whole bunch. Hugh Hook, in his 2011 Sydney Morning Herald article called The Stalk Delivers, stated that the Farr family with their Pinots range from 100% stalks with the flagship to Prey to 40% with Far Rising. The Shiraz has been reduced to 25%. The main purpose is to keep the berries as whole as possible for as long as possible to release their sugar slowly into the fermentation. This gives more gamey, earthy, foresty characters and creates structure, length and savouriness. The wines are always tighter, less fruit forward and never as open as 100% destemmed wines. That was a quote from Nick Farr, and he agrees that they can sometimes taste too vegetal when young, but even a year or two in the bottle transforms this into more attractive complexities, which is what Jamie Good would have been referring to, which I mentioned earlier. So moving on to the next variable, which is when to include the stalks. So there are several ways that the whole bunches are added to the fermentation vessel. They can be added first to the empty tank, then the destemmed grapes added on top. They can be added last so that the stems are punched down through the fermenting juice, or they can be added in layers, a little lasagna-like, with a layer of whole bunches followed by a layer of destemmed and so on until the fermenter is full. There are several notable Australian winemakers who have been using whole bunch inclusion to varying degrees in their red ferments for quite a number of years with great success, such as Tim Kirk at Clonakilla, who started using whole bunch inclusion in his Shiraz and Pinot Noir ferments in 1993. The practice has found a home also in the cooler parts of Victoria with winemakers such as Dave Bicknell, William Downey, Luke Lambert, Gary Mills, who we've already talked about, Rory Lane and Steve Webber, of course, at De Bortleys. The pioneer of extensive stalk usage was Gary Farr of By Far at Geelong and previously Bannockburn. He and his son Nick, who has the label Far Rising, still probe the limits with stalks and are making wonderful Pinot Noirs this way. There are others who have been trialling the technique for the past few years with mixed results, such as Tom Carson at Yabby Lake. So my next slide starts with just looking at, I had a chat with Tim Kirk at Clonakilla Wines as to what he's been doing over quite a number of years with whole bunch fermentation. So as I said, he started using the fermentation technique in 1993. And he drew his inspiration for initially using it from his passionate interest in the Shiraz and Pinot Noir wines of the Rhone Valley and Burgundy. He had read and tasted widely and had become quite passionate about making his wines following many of their traditional techniques, which included whole bunch fermentation as well as co-fermenting his Shiraz with Viognier. Tim said that his percentage of whole bunch that he usually uses sits somewhere between 20 and 35%, and the average is 30. He does say that this percentage is fairly consistent from year to year. They make around 20 fermentation batches each vintage. All are fermented in open-top 2 to 4 tonne fermenters. And he also keeps the various clones and vineyard sections separate from the vineyard through to blending for bottling. He also added that he does do the 100% whole bunch ferment, which did happen in 2015. And this gives him valuable blending options down the track. He also added that the extent of stalk lignification for him is not as important as the vintage and vineyard site effects are. He harvests when the grapes are at their best and doesn't wait for the stalks to lignify. So on the next slide, his standard time on skins is 3 weeks, with manual plunging of caps carried out daily. Plunging is reasonably easy to do throughout the ferment, even with the whole bunches in the ferment. He also sees, the whole bunch portion is added first into the open fermenter, then destemmed. He doesn't crush, and that's laid on top. He sees very little carbonic maceration character in his wines, although come pressing times he does see whole intact berries remaining on the stalks, so there would certainly be some cellular fermentation happening within these berries. It's definitely not an obvious overt carbonic maceration aroma or flavour, and therefore, but it would nonetheless be adding to the overall complexity of the wine. So the benefits for Kirk I've outlined in the next slide, and he sees the main one as being fully capturing the essence of the vineyard. The stem inclusion for him adds a subtle complexity to the resulting wines, and the character is not dominant. After using the technique for over 20 years, he finds it suits his grapes beautifully and is consistently in balance with his wines. The stem inclusion characters, and here he's referring to tannins and flavours, are woven into the tapestry of each of his wines, and they sit comfortably in the background, lifting the pure fruit character of a particular block and enhancing the quality for him of the final blended wine. He concluded by saying that whole bunch adds something. It enhances the beauty and site-specific characters of my grapes and is a counterpoint to the wine. He also thinks that whole bunch inclusion is better suited to cooler climates. So then I talked to Tom Carson at Yabby Lake Vineyard. And on the next slide I just outlined what his points were, but his first experience, so Tom's first experiences with whole bunch inclusion were in 1991 during his last year at Roseworthy, and he was undertaking his vintage experience with Tim Napstein. They were experimenting that year with the Lenswood Pinot Noir using different levels of whole bunches on ferment. And the trials had come about as it was a widely used technique in Burgundy and with other top Pinot wine makers at the time. So Carson uses whole bunch inclusion mainly on his Pinot Noirs, although he does use a tiny bit with Shiraz, but he limits it to under 10%. He finds that with Shiraz it tends to highlight the green vegetative stalk characters and it can easily dominate the flavour profile. He also has found that it does strip some of the richness of Shiraz and reduces the palate to a leaner profile. Carson did tell me that Yabby Lake handpick all of their blocks, which does give him the flexibility right up until the last moment to decide how much whole bunch will be included. And he says that we use it as we see fit with particular clones and sections of the vineyard. It is highly vintage dependent. It is highly vintage dependent as to how much we use each year. So on the next slide I've just highlighted about Yabby Lake's Pinot Noir focus. So the percentage Carson uses of whole bunch is highly dependent on the vintage first, then the clone, and then the block. So just as an example, he told me that in 2011, they used it sparingly. Less than 5% also was used in 2012 and 2013. In 2015, a warmer year, it was up to 25%, and in 2014, it was less than 15%. It's a combination of fruit condition, that is the set and stalk condition, and the potential quality of the vintage. Carson said that the higher the quality of the vintage, the more we use. So we look to assess potential early in the vintage by assessing colour, structure and density of the earlier batches. If we like what we see, we go higher on the percentage of whole bunch inclusion. If the vintage seems lighter, cooler, and stalk condition and fruit density is low, we hold back on how much whole bunch we use. On the next slide, Carson went on to say that he also places his whole bunches in the fermenters first, then crushes over the top. Some batches they use 100% whole bunch, and they crush a small amount first into the bottom of the fermenter to assist with the commencement of fermentation, then place the whole bunches on top. For Carson, the main benefits of using whole bunch inclusion is for perfume and fragrance first, then for the added savoury tannins and palate length. He also says that the influence of carbonic maceration is also very important, as this is adding the fragrance and perfume characters to the wine that he is seeking. He concluded with, it's using whole bunch fermentation is an intuitive approach to when and how much whole bunch to use based on your own experiences. For us, there is no recipe approach to whole bunch usage. Excuse me. And the last person, or last winemaker I talked to was Mark Haseman, who had spent 10 years at AWRI from 99 through to 2009. While he was there, he was working with Dr. Bailey Carrodus, and that was where he was introduced to whole bunch inclusion concept for red ferments. And Carrodus was the first one who introduced Haseman to the basket method, which is interesting. So Haseman told me that with the basket method, the fruit would be completely destemmed, and the stalks were stuffed into a stainless steel basket, and these were then placed into the ferments. The basket method enabled them to remove the stalks when they felt they had had their desired effect. He also added that they often trialled the same batch as 3 separate ferments, so no stalks, stalks added back, and stalks added back in baskets. They found that by using the basket, they were able to then use this technique for ferments where they wanted to have longer macerations, and an extended time on stalks was undesirable. Haseman told me that he found that using this technique added a great spicy complexity to the wine, and it also built the tannin profile. And it also gave him what he called absolute control of how much and for how long. Mark is now a micro-negotiant in Burgundy, and he's also making wine in Cornas in the northern Rhone. He is actually using this basket method in Burgundy with some interesting results, but he doesn't know of anyone else in the region using this technique. He told me that whole bunch for him is about controlling the ferment, slowing it down with a slow release of sugar. It's a great way to build loads of complexity and savoury characters and still keep a lush, creamy feel to the palate, which he described as a velvety mouthfeel. As for Burgundy, it's all about the complexity and finesse. In the big appellations, he felt that it added a structure to the fruit without adding coarseness or bitterness, both characters which he despised in his Pinot Noirs. So in the southern Rhone on the next corner, Haseman makes Shiraz in Cornas, where he uses a lot of whole bunch fermentation. It is, however, he says, very dependent on the year as well as the fruit, the site, and he also was a bit flippant in saying also his mood at the time. So he does use whole bunch fermentation in different proportions. His other comment was, too often he hears people saying, we are a whole bunch people, but in years where it doesn't merit it, the results he finds are unbalanced. He says whole bunch fermentation is a useful technique and an aid for vinification to best suit his wines. He likes it because it adds texture to the wine and helps him control the speed of fermentation, meaning that the cap doesn't tend to get as hot with the destemmed grapes, as the gaps within the bunches in the cap allow for heat to escape. So in summing up on the next slide, the benefits of, this is Haseman again. So his benefits for him are building loads of complexity, the savoury characters that he achieves, and that creamy, lush feeling on the palate. The next slide is about summing up. When it works well, whole bunch fermentation delivers incredibly complex aromatics and flavours. And as I said earlier, they can be described as clean earth, green tobacco, unlicked cigar tobacco, florals, black and white pepper, snap peas. When it doesn't work, however, the whole bunch fermentation can yield a negative result, with the wine being herbaceous, vegetative and green. The use of whole clusters in fermentation can be a bit of a wild card depending on site and vintage if it's not used wisely and judiciously, taking into account vintage and vineyard variations. moving to the next slide, getting the balance right and using the whole bunch inclusion technique to achieve the best results comes from a carefully planned and trial practice with your own fruit, getting to know what suits and what doesn't suit your vineyard, and adapting the amount of whole bunch included from vintage to vintage. In other words, being very flexible about how much you use and when. So getting near the end, the benefits of whole bunch inclusion, I go back to what Jamie Good wrote in his Wine Anorak blog. About one winemaker's whole bunch triumph is another winemaker's green garden atrocity. In conclusion, the end result of whole bunch fermentation, when done well, are wide-ranging, dynamic and reflective of the region, vintage and percentage of whole bunch used, which neatly takes us back to where I started with the very recent Wine Business Monthly blog and how Australian winemakers using this technique are surprising a number of the world's leading sommeliers. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you. If anyone has any questions, thank you.
Thank you, Cathy. We've now reached the Q&A section of our webinar, and to reiterate, to ask a question, please type into the questions section of your control panel in the bottom right corner of your screen. For those with access to a microphone, there's also the option of speaking directly with our presenter by clicking the Raise Hand button. This is located in the top left section of your control panel. So if anyone would like to ask a question, we've got a question here from Z Tang, and he wishes to know, is whole bunch fermentation common in Grenache?
I certainly haven't, no reason why it possibly couldn't be, but I haven't found any reference to it in any of the research that I was doing for the article. Certainly with its historical connections with Burgundy and Hermitage, they're the two varieties that it's most commonly used in. Haven't found anything with reference to it being used in Grenache. I can certainly have a little hunt around specifically and get back to you if you like.
Thank you. If there's any more questions, can you please type them in now? We have another question, Cathy, from Frank Butera, and he's asking, has there been any work done with whole bunch with Gamay?
No, that'll be a similar reply to Grenache. No, I haven't. Again, that's another variety that hasn't popped up as being referred to. I could do another hunt. Also, perhaps talk to someone like Tim Kirk and see if he's actually come across that from his years of researching into it and using it.
Thank you, Frank. There don't appear to be any more questions coming through at the moment. So I think we will end the session. And I would like to thank Cathy for presenting today, and to thank you also to everyone who attended and took part in today's session. For attendees, you will receive a follow-up email with a link to this recording and a link to a survey. The next AWRI webinar is scheduled for 20th of April 2017, when Eric Wilkes from the AWRI will present closures, latest understanding of their impact. If you would like to register for this webinar, please visit the AWRI website. On behalf of the AWRI webinar team, I would like to thank you for attending this year's AWRI webinar series, and would like to wish you a happy Christmas and New Year and a successful 2017 vintage.